The gallery smelled like stale Prosecco, expensive printer ink, and the damp wool of 100 winter coats. The commercial heating system in the Chelsea loft fought a losing battle against the biting November wind coming directly off the Hudson River, leaving the massive windows coated in a thick layer of freezing condensation. I stood in the far corner of the room, my back pressed flat against the exposed brick wall, keeping my hands buried deep in the pockets of my dark canvas jacket. The crowd was loud. They moved in tight, shifting clusters, pointing at the massive, high-contrast prints hanging on the sterile white walls. They held their narrow, fragile glasses of wine, tilting their heads and nodding as if they understood the exact geometry of the destruction in front of them. The photographs were mine. 30 massive prints detailing the absolute, brutal aftermath of structural fires across the 5 boroughs. There were no people in the frames, just charred timber, calcified plaster, and the chaotic, twisted angles of collapsed steel I-beams. I shot them on a heavy 35mm forensic camera after my official arson investigations concluded. The gallery curator, a man in a velvet blazer who had spent the last hour trying to introduce me to various art collectors, called it industrial abstract expressionism. I called it documenting the exact moment a building finally gave up. I checked the dial on my watch. 9:40. 20 minutes until I could legally walk out of my own exhibition without insulting the host. I pushed off the brick wall and navigated through the crowd. I slipped past a group of critics debating the use of negative space in a photo of a collapsed Bronx tenement, keeping my head down. I moved toward the framing table situated near the main exit. A small stack of blank guestbook pages sat next to a dying, asymmetrical floral arrangement. Sitting perfectly centered on the black table, entirely separate from the glossy promotional flyers, was a thick, heavily textured business card. I picked it up. The front was stark white, bearing a minimalist black logo. The Anderson Grand, Historic Theater and Arts. Beneath that, printed in sharp serif font, Leona Anderson, Managing Director. I turned the card over. The back was completely blank, except for a single word written in sharp, aggressive black ink. Tonight, underneath the word was a handwritten address located deep in the garment district. The ink had bitten into the cardstock so hard it left a raised, physical ridge under my thumb. The angles of the letters were sharp, hurried, lacking any polite curvature. I didn't bother reading the gallery's promotional brochure. I didn't look back to see if the curator was watching me leave. I was already moving toward the exit, pushing through the heavy glass doors into the freezing New York night. The drive took exactly 12 minutes. The traffic on 8th Avenue was a slow, miserable crawl of yellow cabs and delivery trucks, the taillights bleeding red across the wet, slick asphalt. I kept the heater low, the heavy diesel engine of my F-250, providing a steady, vibrating hum that grounded my focus. The municipal dispatch radio bolted under the dashboard crackled with occasional static, calling out medical emergencies in Queens, but my zone remained quiet. I parked my truck illegally beside a rusted fire hydrant at the corner of 38th Street, throwing my laminated municipal placard onto the dashboard. The icy rain was beginning to turn into sleet, bouncing off the heavy hood of the truck. I reached into the back seat, grabbed the thick canvas straps of my heavy equipment duffel, and hauled it out into the weather. The Anderson Grand was a massive, imposing 6-story brick structure built in the 1920s. The architecture was solid, heavy masonry, designed to outlast the city itself. The wraparound marquee was completely dark, the bulb housings empty and cold against the sleet. The front brass doors were chained shut behind heavy accordion security gates. I walked down the narrow side alley, my heavy boots splashing through shallow, freezing puddles that gathered in the uneven concrete. The heavy steel service door near the loading dock was propped open by a single, crumbling red brick. I stepped into the alley. The wind was cut off here, replacing the freezing, moving air with something entirely stagnant. I stopped mid-step. My throat tightened instinctively. I drew another slow breath through my nose until the copper bite confirmed the threat. Ozone. Melted polyvinyl chloride. The distinct, bitter, metallic tang of scorched copper wiring. The building was bleeding. I walked to the steel door, kicked the brick away with the toe of my boot, and pulled the heavy metal wide open. "Don't turn on the lights," a voice said from the absolute darkness of the landing. A narrow beam of a tactical flashlight clicked on, hitting the concrete floor and illuminating a pair of scuffed leather boots. The beam angled up slightly, casting long, sharp shadows against the distressed plaster walls. She stood at the bottom of the concrete stairwell. She wore a heavy charcoal overcoat over dark slacks, her dark hair pulled back severely from her face. She carried a clipboard against her chest like a shield. She looked like a woman who had been fighting a siege for 6 months and was entirely out of ammunition. I reached under my canvas jacket and let the silver FDNY Captain's shield pinned to my belt catch the flashlight beam just long enough for her to stop breathing like she was about to bolt. "The photography is just how I process the job after the yellow tape comes down," I said quietly, letting the heavy steel door click shut behind me to seal us in the dark. The ambient sound of the street traffic vanished completely. "You left a card at my table. I saw the prints in the West Room," Leona said, lowering the beam of her light to the floor. "The ones focused on the V patterns of smoke damage along the baseboards. You don't just take pictures of the ash, Captain. You look for the exact point of failure." "Usually," I agreed. I set my heavy duffel onto the concrete floor. The sound was a dull, heavy thud. "I smell scorched copper and deployed halon. You didn't call the fire department?" She let out a sharp, cynical breath that plumed white in the freezing air of the stairwell. "If a municipal inspector shows up to a smoke call at this hour, they red-tag the building automatically pending a full structural review. I have a 300-person charity gala booked in this venue tomorrow night. It's fully catered. The deposit is spent. If the gala fails, the donors will vanish by sunrise and the bank will follow with a foreclosure notice by noon." "Show me the panel," I said. I unzipped my duffel and pulled out my Pelican 7060 LED tactical flashlight and a digital multi-gas detector. She turned without another word and led me down the narrow, brick-lined corridor deep into the mechanical basement. The ambient temperature dropped 10 degrees the further we descended. The smell of deployed halon gas and burnt plastic grew aggressively stronger, coating the back of my throat with a bitter, chemical film. My beam cut a sharp white path through the dusty, static air, settling on a massive, industrial gray electrical panel mounted securely to the far brick wall. Thick, galvanized conduit pipes snaked out of the top of the box like iron veins. The heavy steel door of the panel was blackened at the seams and warped outward. "Stay back," I instructed, my voice dropping into my operational register. I walked up to the panel. I didn't touch the metal housing. I pulled a thermal imaging camera from my heavy utility belt, powering it on. The digital screen glowed, cycling through its calibration sequence. I swept the FLIR camera across the ceiling joists first, ensuring the heat hadn't traveled up the conduit to start a secondary smolder in the floorboards above us. The joists registered as a cool, safe blue. Then I pointed the lens directly at the panel. The brick wall surrounding the box sat at exactly 60 degrees. The center of the steel panel glowed a bright, angry white-orange on the screen, reading 95 degrees. The primary fire was extinguished by the halon, but the massive thermal mass of the commercial breakers was still holding dangerous, latent heat. I put the imager away, pulled on a pair of thick, puncture-resistant nitrile gloves, and used the pry bar attachment of my multi-tool to force the warped steel door open. The metal groaned loudly before popping free. The inside of the box was a catastrophic mess of melted, fused plastic breakers and charred wiring. I traced the main high-voltage feed lines with the narrow tip of my penlight, looking past the obvious surface damage to find the specific catalyst. "There," I said softly, the beam freezing on a specific terminal block in the lower left corner. Leona stepped up beside my shoulder, maintaining a cautious distance from the exposed wiring. I could hear the uneven, rapid rhythm of her breathing in the quiet room. "What is it?" "Someone bypassed the main grounding lug," I explained, pointing the concentrated beam at a thick, isolated piece of solid copper wire wedged maliciously behind the primary breaker. They bridged the hot phase directly to the neutral bar. The moment the massive HVAC system kicked on upstairs to heat the building for tomorrow's prep, it pulled an immense electrical load, bypassed the breaker's safety trip, and started a slow, intense smolder. It's a deliberate incendiary device. She closed her eyes, her jaw clenching so tight a muscle jumped in her cheek. Vance. Chief Inspector Vance, with the Department of Buildings, she said, her voice laced with raw fatigue. He's been auditing this property for 6 months, hunting for any obscure reason to shut me down. Yesterday, he told me he was coming back on Monday for a final compliance check. If this panel had fully caught fire tonight, he could have legally condemned the entire structure by morning. Do you have a licensed commercial electrician on your payroll? I asked, stepping back from the panel to assess the room's ventilation. My regular guy won't touch the property, she said flatly. Vance threatened to pull his city vendor license if he did work on this address. I'm completely blacklisted from 14th Street to 42nd. I looked at the heavy steel panel, calculating the voltage requirements and the strict legal boundaries of my badge. I'm an investigator. I document the sabotage, I isolate the load, and I secure the scene. I do not rewire commercial high-voltage panels without an active permit. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket, but Vance doesn't own the Bronx. I'm calling a licensed commercial Sparky from my district. He owes me a significant favor. He brings the replacement breakers, he pulls the emergency digital permit under his own license, and he does the physical splice. I stay here to supervise the environment and officially log the incident as a stabilized hazard. She didn't argue. She didn't question the logistics or the cost. She simply nodded. We had 25 minutes to wait. The adrenaline of the initial response was fading fast, leaving the freezing dampness of the basement to seep into the concrete. Leona began to pace the narrow aisle between the massive iron boiler and the electrical wall. Her eyes darted to the blackened panel, then to the floor, then to the dark stairwell. Her hands flexed repeatedly at her sides. The absolute inability to physically fix the mess in her own building was eating away at her composure. I looked around the room, spotting a heavy push broom leaning against the far brick wall. I walked over, picked it up, and held it out toward her by the wooden handle. The halon discharge left a liquid residue near the floor drain, I said, keeping my tone entirely conversational and stripping any authority from my voice. Sweep the moisture into the grate. Give Mike a dry place to kneel when he gets here. She looked at the broom, then at my face. She took the wooden handle. The rhythmic, repetitive sound of the stiff bristles dragging across the concrete floor filled the basement, slow and methodical. The harsh lines of her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch with every sweep. It was a tangible, physical task that gave her back an ounce of control in her own building. While she swept, I went to work. Before touching the evidence, I took 30 high-resolution photographs of the bridged wire from multiple angles, placing a standardized plastic measuring scale in the frame to establish exact dimensions. The flash illuminated the dark basement like brief, violent lightning strikes. I pulled a pair of heavy insulated pliers from my kit, carefully extracted the piece of bridging copper, dropped it into a sterile anti-static evidence bag, and sealed the top with red tamper-evident tape. My guy, Mike, arrived carrying a heavy canvas tool bucket. He grumbled about the freezing rain and the late hour, shaking icy water from his coat, but he took one look at my captain's shield clipped to my belt and got straight to work. They wanted it to burn slow, Mike muttered, shining his headlamp into the charred box. He looked at me over his shoulder, shaking his head. Amateur hour, but effective. Exactly, I said, holding my flashlight steady on the main bus bar so he could work. They wanted it to look like an old building failing under a heavy commercial load. For the next hour, the basement was completely silent except for the sharp sound of wire cutters snapping through heavy gauge insulation, the crinkle of fresh electrical tape, and the precise ratcheting click of a torque wrench. Leona leaned against the bottom of the stairs, watching the repair with unwavering focus. Throw the main breaker, Mike said finally, wiping his hands on a grease rag and stepping back. Leona stepped forward, reached past Mike without hesitation, and shoved the massive plastic switch upward with a heavy clack. The basement hummed instantly. Overhead fluorescent lights flickered, buzzed aggressively for 2 seconds, then caught, flooding the room with harsh white light. The distant, heavy rumble of the industrial HVAC system kicked on from the roof, sending a deep, reassuring vibration down through the brick walls. The panel remained cold, silent, and perfectly stable. Mike nodded, handed me a copy of the digital permit receipt to review, and headed heavily up the stairs. My phone vibrated in my pocket a minute later. A text from Mike. Permit. Uploaded to the city server. You're covered. Leona let out a slow, measured breath. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, inadvertently leaving a dark smudge of carbon soot across her pale temple. I unzipped the side pocket of my kit, pulled out a packaged industrial wet wipe, and held it out across the workbench. She took the small silver packet and wiped the soot off her temple with the intensity of someone personally offended by carbon. I don't blame you, I noted dryly, watching her scrub. Industrial exhaust doesn't belong on a tailored blazer. She paused, looking at the dirty wipe, and a short, sudden laugh escaped her. A brief, genuine micro-joy that broke the heavy tension entirely. It really doesn't. It's compliant, I told her, packing my flashlight away and securing the clasps on my duffel. The bridging wire is secured in my evidence bag. You can run your gala. She walked over to a small wooden workbench and picked up a clipboard. What's the total for the supervision? $300, I stated, naming a flat rate that wouldn't insult her independence. And a strict promise. You let Vance walk in tomorrow. You act like the breaker simply tripped due to age and you had it legally replaced. We survive the inspection. Then we take the physical evidence directly to the district attorney. She wrote the check with quick, decisive strokes. The scratching sound of the pen on paper was loud in the quiet room. She tore it off and handed it directly to me. I'll be here at noon tomorrow, I said, sliding it into my pocket. I didn't go home to sleep. Back at the firehouse, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the dispatch desk at 3 a.m., I pulled up the municipal archives on my terminal. I printed the entire Historic Preservation Exemptions Index and highlighted the exact paragraph Vance would inevitably try to weaponize when he realized his primary sabotage had failed. At 11:30 a.m. the next day, I parked outside the Anderson Grand. In the harsh daylight, the scale of her operation was massive. Delivery trucks were backed up to the curb, offloading heavy crates of glassware, silver chafing dishes, and tall stacks of folded wooden chairs. Inside, the theater was a breathtaking expanse of restored gold leaf, towering plaster pillars, and dark mahogany woodwork. The air was chaotic with the shouts of catering managers and the high-pitched whine of power drills as lighting technicians assembled a temporary stage. I didn't immediately look for Leona. I walked straight to the main stage, climbing the side stairs. I looked up at the rigging, locating the heavy asbestos fire curtain suspended above the proscenium arch. A stagehand was taping down a bundle of cables directly beneath the drop line. Is this curtain active? I asked the rigger. The guy barely looked up. Yeah, it's fine. We never drop it. I stepped past him, located the primary release pin on the wall mount, and pulled it hard. The massive, heavy fire curtain plummeted downward, slamming into the stage floor with a deafening boom that shook the wood and kicked up a massive cloud of decades-old dust. The entire crew went dead silent. I reached down, re-engaged the heavy winch motor, and locked the pin back into place as the curtain slowly rose. Now it's fine, I told the rigger. Keep the drop zone clear. I turned around. Leona was standing in the center aisle, holding a digital tablet. She had watched the entire interaction. She didn't look annoyed by the interruption. She looked anchored by it. She wore a tailored black suit today, the jacket sharp and perfectly cut, masking the exhaustion of the previous night completely. I walked down the steps to join her. I began walking the perimeter of the room, my eyes automatically tracking the illuminated emergency exit signs. I checked the hydraulic tension on the panic bars, ensuring the heavy brass doors swung outward freely. I noted the clearance of the ceiling sprinkler heads, ensuring no temporary drapery blocked the spray radius. I was deep in the mechanical assessment when I noticed a tall stack of heavy cardboard boxes blocking a secondary fire exit corridor in the back corner of the lobby. I hoisted the top box onto my shoulder. It was heavy, filled with water and thick glass vases. I carried it 20 feet away, setting it carefully against a dead structural wall. I repeated the process 4 times, moving methodically until the egress corridor was completely, legally clear. When I turned around, Leona was standing 5 feet away, watching me. She held out a chilled bottle of water. "Those were the floral centerpieces," she said quietly. I took the bottle, twisting the plastic cap off. They blocked a designated egress route. Vance would have written a $1,000 citation just for that before he even reached the basement stairs. She nodded, accepting the correction without ego. I turned back to the cocktail table where I had set down a large cardboard cube I had carried in from my truck. I pulled a utility knife, sliced the packing tape, and opened the flaps, revealing a heavy, industrial-grade HEPA air scrubber unit. "The basement still smells like scorched plastic and ozone," I explained, pulling the thick power cord free. "If Vance walks down those stairs and smells that, he'll demand to tear the drywall open looking for a smoldering fire." We plug this in near the stairwell. It erases the scent entirely in 40 minutes. Leona stared at the heavy gray machine. She stepped closer, reaching out, her hand resting flat against the plastic housing. "You don't miss a single detail, do you?" "I read environments," I said, keeping my voice low amidst the noise of the room. "I read what threatens them, and I removed the threat." "Miss Anderson?" A loud, aggressive voice cut through the ambient noise of the theater. Chief Inspector Vance strode down the center aisle, accompanied by an assistant clutching a clipboard. He moved with the arrogant pace of a man who believed he already owned the floorboards beneath his shoes. Leona stiffened beside me, her posture locked. I stepped slightly in front of her, placing myself squarely between her and the approaching threat. "Inspector Vance," Leona said smoothly, projecting absolute calm. "You're early." "I felt it was prudent to ensure public safety immediately," Vance said, a predatory smile touching the corner of his mouth. His eyes shifted to me. "Who are you? A stagehand?" "Leif Jimenez," I said flatly. "FDNY Fire Investigation Bureau. Anything I document becomes an official state fire marshal file, and that file outranks your clipboard." The assistant's pen stopped moving mid-stroke. Vance's smile vanished. We walked them down to the basement. The HEPA scrubber was already running, emitting a steady white noise hum. The air smelled perfectly clean. Vance pulled the main electrical panel door open, staring at the brand-new, perfectly torqued breakers. The sabotage was erased. "The panel passes," Vance gritted out, slamming the steel door shut. He looked wildly around the basement, desperate for a technicality. He pointed up at the massive galvanized steel ducts. "But this ventilation system lacks modern backdraft dampers. It's a massive smoke suffocation hazard. Draft the red tag." I pulled the highlighted printout I'd prepared at 3 a.m. from my back pocket and slid it directly onto the wooden workbench in front of him. "Historic preservation exemption," I stated, my voice echoing coldly. "Passive draft architecture is entirely grandfathered under an active suppression system." I took a step forward, dropping the absolute bottom line. "If you write that red tag today, you bankrupt this charity gala and hand the deed to your brother's development firm by Monday? It's a transparent conflict of interest, Vance. And I have the timeline documented." Vance stared at the highlighted text on the page. His pen hovered uselessly. He realized he was utterly outgunned. "The ventilation passes," he said, the words tasting like ash. He dropped the pen, shoved past his assistant without a word, and walked rapidly up the concrete stairs. The heavy steel door slammed shut above us. Leona gripped the edge of the wooden workbench, her knuckles turning white. She exhaled a shaky breath. I unzipped my canvas duffel bag and pulled out the thick, plastic evidence bag containing the charred bridging wire. I laid it gently on the bench next to a sealed manila envelope containing the forensic photos. "Take this file to the district attorney's corruption task force on Monday morning," I told her. She looked up at me, her defensive walls completely shattered, leaving only raw gratitude in her eyes. She took a half step toward me. My fingers flexed aggressively against the heavy canvas lining of my pockets. Taking advantage of an adrenaline crash wasn't in my protocol. I protect structures. I don't corner people. "You have a gala to run," I said, taking a deliberate, measured half-step backward to maintain the boundary. "Go check the lighting rigs." She noticed the retreat. She saw the intense restraint, and a quiet, profound understanding settled in her eyes. She picked up the envelope and the evidence bag, holding them tightly against her chest. By Monday, the official incident report was typed, printed, and officially filed in the state database, waiting for the only person who could legally weaponize it. The weekend had passed in a slow, brutal rhythm. I worked a grueling 48-hour shift at the firehouse in the Bronx. We caught 3 calls before dawn on Sunday. By the time we backed the rig into the bay, I smelled permanently of wet ash and diesel exhaust. I sat at the metal dispatch desk, filling out incident reports. Marcus, my lieutenant, walked past and dropped a heavy mug of black coffee onto my desk. "You've been staring at a blank screen for 20 minutes, Cap," Marcus noted, leaning against the doorframe. "Who are you waiting to hear from?" "No one," I said, picking up the hot mug. I pulled a black marker from the cup on the desk and wrote, "Anderson Grand," pending in the bottom corner of the shift whiteboard. It was a minimal action, a small physical anchor to prove the weekend wasn't a hallucination. Just waiting on an administrative structural review. Marcus snorted softly, recognizing my absolute refusal to engage in gossip. He clapped the doorframe twice and walked away. My phone had buzzed on the desk later that night, a text from the gallery curator informing me that 3 prints had sold for asking price. I swiped the notification away without answering. On Monday afternoon, I sat in a quiet corner of the city library, surrounded by the comforting smell of old paper and floor wax. I was reviewing a heavy volume on historic timber framing. The contrast of the quiet library against the noisy theater and chaotic firehouse was a necessary grounding mechanism. The heavy oak chair across the reading table slid back with a quiet scrape. Leona sat down. The dark circles under her eyes were entirely gone. She wore a soft beige sweater, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She placed a white cardboard cup of black coffee on the table and slid it across the polished wood until it touched my notebook. Steam curled from the lid. "I met with the DA at 9 a.m., she said, keeping her voice low. "They opened a formal corruption case. Vance was placed on administrative leave pending the grand jury investigation. The red tags are permanently invalidated." I wrapped my bare hand around the cardboard cup, feeling the intense heat transfer into my palm. It was the same quiet, reliable ritual I used to ground myself. She reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a thick legal document bound in a professional blue cover. "Exclusive retainer agreement. Facility safety and compliance management." "I need a permanent compliance director," Leona said. I didn't sign blindly. I opened the heavy folder, skimming the liability clauses, the termination terms, and the required hours. The parameters were clean. The retainer guaranteed 60 hours a month, full structural oversight, and a mandate to personally handle every municipal inspection from now on. "I'm a minimalist," I told her, holding her gaze. "I don't navigate high society galas. I just fix what's broken." "I don't need someone to navigate galas," Leona replied, her voice steady and absolutely certain. "I need someone who stays when the fire starts." I picked up the heavy black pen she had placed on the table, signed my name on the solid black line, and pushed the contract back across the wood. She stood up, holding the folder. "Walk back to the theater with me." We left the library and walked the 4 blocks to the Anderson Grand. The marquee was lit. Inside the main lobby, the teardown crew from the gala was moving equipment. Elena, her floor manager, rushed over with a clipboard. "Leona, the electrical vendor is asking about the load capacity for next week's show." Leona didn't even look at the clipboard. She turned slightly, ensuring the crew nearby could hear her clearly. She pointed a pen directly at me. "This is Captain Jimenez. He's our new structural compliance director. If he says the circuit holds, it holds. You clear every single mechanical question through him." Elena blinked, processed the shift in authority instantly, nodded once, and hurried away to inform the vendor. Leona looked back at me, a quiet, undeniable warmth settling into her posture. The absolute weight of a heavy lock finally sliding securely into place. I held my coffee, the heat anchoring me to the floorboards, and took a slow sip. The end. Closing thoughts. I learned that true trust isn't about grand romantic declarations. It's about finding someone who recognizes your vulnerabilities and methodically works to reinforce them so you never have to feel unsafe again. Real love isn't dramatic fireworks. It's the steady, reliable structure that keeps the roof from caving in. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.